This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Deracheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This entire podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. All of these episodes draw on the rich sources and discussions of women and mitzvot on deracheha.org. This episode takes a deep dive into the Mitzvot of Purim, Megilla, the Purim Seuda, Mishloach, Manot, and Matanot La-evyonim, gifts for the poor, with an emphasis on women's obligation in these mitzvot and halachot of women reading the Megillah for other women.
Hi, Yosefa.
Hi, Shayna.
It's pretty hard for me to believe that we are so close to Purim. It's like time is flying this year. I'm not sure exactly why. Sometimes I think about the fact that maybe over the last 2 years in war, I don't know how you felt, but like time slowed down. Sometimes it almost felt like we were paused or we were frozen. And now all of a sudden it's like picked up again, regular life. And here we are. Purim is very, very close, a week away from when this podcast is being released, which means that there's already a lot to think about. And while there are so many aspects of Purim that I really appreciate and I'm excited for, and, that I get into the mood and anticipate, I think some of what we want to do today is speak about how we could really make this holiday meaningful and how, especially as women, we could connect to some of the deeper ideas that are in the background of this holiday, which means that we might need to start a little bit by removing some of the pressures or the obstacles that sometimes get in the way, specifically for women, in terms of being able to really experience this day.
Totally. I think that on the level of just the holiday itself, I feel like Purim tends to surprise me less than Pesach because I work in a religious setting,
right,
and I still have, I have school-age kids. So there's a lot of like Adar prep. Do you know what I'm saying? Like from Rosh Chodesh, right, when the month begins, in religious settings, I think in many Jewish school settings, but definitely in Israel, kind of like chaos abounds, right? So there's
much more so in Israel.
More so in Israel. There's a lot of special programming. Some of it's amazing special programming. I love the special programming in where we work in Mitalos.
But the joke is that like school's basically over.
Yeah, kids can't get homework, and like it's sort of, and already I would say honestly, I think already 2 months ago, my kids started talking to me about costumes and what they want to do, and so I feel like Purim actually expands way beyond its allowed boundaries in my life. And then Pesach tends to creep up on me pretty soon after. So I guess I would say, if I'm being really, really honest, which I guess is my calling card in life, which is that Purim is a holiday that challenges me on a whole host of levels. One is that somehow, like the Purim Seuda, it's taken us a long time to kind of figure out what our ritual is, who we eat with. We are now for the first time eating with the same group of friends for a second year in a row, which is really nice. But for a while, it actually took us a long time. There's something about the day you're going to eat with people that are close by, depending where family lives. Are you eating with family or not? Something about that. We also have like the whole Yerushalayim, outside Yerushalayim split. So like, do you have 2 days of Purim or do you not? Anyways, it's like a very specific dilemma, but I think that the who we eat with was a part of it for a long time. I would also say that I don't really like costumes and I don't really like jest. Maybe on the Scrooge of Purim, but I find these things not so enjoyable. And when I have to be in charge of like organizing them, it's not such a fun place for me to be in. And again, as life has continued, kids have grown up. Obviously, thankfully, I'm doing this with a partner. Right. So we have, take different responsibilities. And the other thing I'll say, just to totally solidify my Scrooge identity, is to say that like healthy food is a pillar of our lifestyle. And so there are, I would say, many religious moments involve not healthy food. And then there are some days that are really special in how much they put an emphasis on like utter garbage. So it's just hard. It's hard for me to enjoy it. At this point, I don't feel the tension within my family because we have a system and my kids are on board, and it largely doesn't cause tension. The lingering items that they hide in their closet are a thing, but meaning but
they're normal kids.
Yeah, they are normal, thank God. But bigadol in our home, it's okay. But that was a stressor for me for a long time. Also, I say this seriously, I really like there are things that they won't come into our home, and I also don't want to throw them out, and I also feel bad giving them to people who are sick, who I also think shouldn't eat them. So like it like put me in like a moral dilemma very often. I know I'm a Scrooge. I get it. I'm serious about things. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, even I, who am not such a health person at all, there's a difference between like not healthy and like absolute garbage.
Yeah.
So, like there's a lot of that.
There's a lot of
around the
absolute
Purim.
garbage going on. So I would say that, and we're going to talk about today because throughout the years I have kind of tried to mine Purim for the meaning that I think that I can be present in and feel happy in it. What does create a sense of fulfillment, and there are those things. So with all those things that I said, I have managed to sort of figure out how to reorient myself in this holiday so that it is something that's meaningful. And I just want to say that it's true about anything in life, whether it's a holiday or a family practice or right. There are situations where there's a lot of challenges to them for who we are. And then we have to figure out how to reorient ourselves so that we can experience it, hopefully, positively.
Want to just tap into the costume piece for a minute because I'm also not a big costume person. I appreciate the idea. I think the idea is that things aren't always what they seem. And in the Purim story, you know what's going on. Like before our eyes isn't exactly what's happening beneath the surface. And there's something about the costume element of that that's meaningful and that is important and that touches on deeper meaning.
And freeing, by the way, for people. It could be very, very healthy and helpful.
Opportunity to kind of let out a different side of yourself. As I know that there are many women who get really into it, like even adults here in Israel get really into their own costumes, or if they're planning, for their kids or their spouses. But for me, like costumes are always a big stress in my house because I'm the kind of person that I was like, you know what, if we could buy something from the store that will make it easier, like let's do that. But I have kids who are like very artistic and very creative and have always very big ideas. So they were like, no, we're not buying anything. We're making our costumes. And it always involved cardboard boxes and it always involved a tremendous amount of work.
There are two on my porch right now. But
and it always ends up with someone crying because like the vision in their head didn't exactly match what ended up happening, in real life. And there was, I don't know, I could just, like 1 year, and they also always wanted a theme. So like 1 year they were all chocolate bars, and the year that they instituted recycling in Gush Etzion, and so they're like, oh, we're all going to be a different like recycling garbage and really creative ideas. But then they would get into the boxes and they realized we can't sit, or like we can't go to the bathroom, or we can't dance like this. So I can't say that I am too upset that my youngest, Baruch Hashem, is 12 and a half and in 7th grade, and they are independent, and the costume thing is no longer dominating the weeks leading up to this holiday. So there's something a little bit fun about the anticipation and the buildup, but I'm happy to like not be dealing with that, because oftentimes I would come to Purim like exhausted, like drained, or that very night as they're getting ready for the Megilla, someone's upset or crying, so that could be tough. And I think also like all the prep, like if there was one thing, like costumes were the only thing, but like you're managing the costumes while you're also shopping and putting together Mishloach Manot
with a theme, with some very amazing
out of control, or you're planning on cooking for a Purim Seuda. So on the one hand, I don't want to take away from that like anticipation, because there is something that when we prepare for a Chag and we invest in it and we put a lot of thought into it, there's something very, very powerful about that. And on the other hand, sometimes we're so in routines, or our communities like kind of push us into routines, that we forget that we're allowed to think about, is this working for me? And I think just to encourage everybody who's listening, like if we're getting stressed and we're yelling at our kids, or if we are feeling like too tired to really be awake for the Megillah because we're so exhausted, so then maybe we need to shift our balances. And also we could think about, what do I want to prioritize this year? Like if I'm hosting a really big Seuda this year, so then maybe I'm not really going to do Mishloach Manot, or if we really invested in the costumes, so then maybe it's not the year to host this Seuda. But definitely to think about where you want to put your energies and where you want to lay low.
I wanted just to think a little bit about the Mitzvot of Purim. And we're going to get deeper into Megilla reading later on, but we really have 4 specific mitzvot that, again, all start with a mem. And before we get into that, I just want to give a shout out to Rabbanit Debbie Zimmerman, who wrote the Mitzvot of Purim article on the Deracheha website that we're like deeply drawing from in our conversation here. So we have our 4 mitzvot. We have Matanot, La-evyonim, the gifts to the poor, Mishloach, Manot. We have the Mishteh, which is the Purim Seuda, and of course, Megilla reading. So the first mitzvah I want to talk about is Matanot La-evyonim, okay, which again is gifts to the poor.
Gets less press, gets like lost.
Yes, it does get lost. Also, because a lot of times we sort of we outsource it. We just give money, put it in a pushka, so we don't really think about it. But it's actually it's an equally important mitzvah of Purim. What the mitzvah is supposed to be is a gift of either food or money to two distinct people on Purim. And the idea is to include the more vulnerable people in our community in this day. Exactly. And to enable them to really be able to take part in the day. The idea of Manot La-evyonim is not so that now they can, go send their child to school, meaning it's so that they could take part in the Mitzvot of Purim specifically. And this is mentioned in Megilla as a decree by Mordechai. And he really takes his cue from the Torah's instructions of the Regalim. We have multiple psukim that speak about this idea. But just for example, in Dvarim, in Perek Tet Zayin Yud Daled in 16:14, ושמחת בחגיך, אתה ובנך וביתך ועבדך ואמתך, והלוי והגר והיתום והאלמנה אשר בשעריך. That when you have a chag, and you're going to have simchat chag, everybody is supposed to be able to participate in it, right? Also those who are the members of society who have less means. And so this idea is really what's drawn upon, and again, that's a whole conversation in and of itself, the way that they try to institute Purim as a holiday that harken back to mitzvot in the Torah, okay? But this is one of the expressions of that.
Drawing on that.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Ritva, for example, one of our prominent Rishonim, he explains that Matanot La-evyonim and Purim are not really charity, okay? But they're really there, as I said before, so that everybody can celebrate Purim. And therefore also we're not background checking people to make sure they're poor, okay? The idea is, I'll also just say that my father, Alav Shalom, he always used to say, if somebody feels a need to put out their hand and ask for something, he always gave tzedakah. I mean,
Purim, you're supposed to give something.
Exactly. So on Purim, for sure, that was his life policy. It's something that I always remember. I also just want to say that when I think about how to make this more meaningful, if someone wants, again, we could also just, check it off the box and give the money. And there's always in many shuls or many organizations, they have a place where you can deliver the money. And then someone makes sure that on Purim date, they give out the money to those who need it. But I do want to say that if this is something that people felt was very meaningful for them, they could decide that Matanot La-evyonim is more of the mitzvah that they're putting emphasis on this year. And they could go, I know people who on Purim always go do chesed, or they go to a hospital, or they go to nursing homes, or that they dafka on Purim. I know I have a friend who does this as a family every year with her family. So that it's so beautiful, mamash. And they go
prioritize this aspect of the day.
And they're going to do all the mitzvot, but this is what they really put a lot of their effort into. So the next mitzvah that we have is Mishloach Manot, which is sending sort of portions of food to others. The idea is to send 2 portions of 2 different kinds of foods, and it's supposed to enhance the Seuda. Again, the idea being it's to enhance the celebration of Purim itself, the day of Purim. And we see something like this done also in the book of Nehemiah, where it's a really important parak in Nehemiah and Perek Chet, where they basically have a Torah reading and they haven't heard the Torah. Basically, you hear and understand in a very long time, and they start hearing the laws and they start crying because they're so overwhelmed because they haven't been keeping this. And it says in Sefer Nehemiah, "Vayomer lehem lechu ichlu mashmanim ushtu mamtakim v'shelchu manot le'en nachon lo." Okay, that go after the first day. Nehemiah says, go, take a break, go eat, go drink, send food to those who don't have it, those who weren't prepared for this moment, and then come back and we'll continue this the next day. And so we see, again, a similar idea. Everybody wants to go home, eat and drink, celebrate this day, but also make sure to worry about those who don't necessarily have that. And I'll also just say that when it comes to Mishlochei Manot, that it might also be another function of it has been suggested. That it creates affinity among Jews, right? It's a sense of community. There might even be an interesting idea to send it to somebody who we don't get along with. It also, I think, is an interesting...
someone new to the community, or someone that we want to really make a connection to, as opposed to our 10 best friends.
Exactly. I really have tried that also in the past few years. We live in a neighborhood that new people kind of move in every single year. And it also could be to Miluim families, right? Or people that
someone who's going to light up their eyes about they thought about us.
Yeah. I always say I would say 40% is the people you have to give, or else it's insulting, meaning good friends. And then but most of it is, to people that wouldn't have expected it, or, that it'll make them happy. So I think that piece is also, to me, part of the meaning of what Mishlochei Manot can do. In terms of women being obligated in these 2 mitzvot of both Matanot La-evyonim and Mishloach Manot, so we have the principle here of Af hen hayu be'oto hanis. It's a principle that we've mentioned before, and we'll keep mentioning it on Hanukkah here, and we're going to mention it again, I'm sure, when we talk about Pesach. The idea that because women were included in the salvation of this holiday, that they're also obligated in the resulting mitzvot. And this obligates women in Megilla, and it also extends to Mishloach Manot. I'll also say another piece about that, which is that one opinion of what Afen Hayubo Tohanes, that they were also in these miracles, is that also some of them were brought about by women specifically, whether it's the midwives in the Egypt story when they saved Moshe, or in this case, literally by Esther, right? So that, again,
here's the most explicit case of Afen Hayubo Tohanes, if you understand it as the woman effectuating the miracle, like Esther.
Yeah, and I would even say she effectuates the holiday also, right, along with Mordechai. But that also, I think, is a significant point. In the case of a married couple, they can fulfill their mitzvah jointly as long as they include the amounts of food that are sufficient for each of their individual obligations. So that would mean 4 portions of 2 kinds of food, right? That would be the minimum. And I will just say, which is really important, is that there still is a preference for a married woman to give at least 1 set of her own mishloach manot, right? Because it's her individual obligation. So that's, I think, an interesting piece that we often don't think about.
Thinks about that.
Exactly. Sure. Another piece that comes up when it comes to Purim, and I definitely remember this personally for myself, is the mitzvah of Mishloach Manot when someone is in Avelut. A mourner still does have an obligation of sending Mishloach Manot, but we often say that they should sort of send a minimum of 1 package with the 2 different kinds of foods. And it could be more simple, it could be less festive, but that's not an obligatory element to it. And I will also say that if someone is a mourner in the context of their family, the family still can give Mishloach Manot, meaning they're part of the family, and the family can still give regular, and it could be left in that context.
We also don't typically give to people in mourning. Yeah. So if you're dropping something off, you'll give it, that's
the Ramah. That's the Ashkenazi specific.
The Ashkenazi practice is not to give it to someone that's in mourning.
Yeah. I'm going to also just say, just to see that scenario for a moment, that a day that there's an emphasis on like this jovial, jesty kind of thing, for some it might be welcome relief where they are in their mourning process, and for some it might be very jarring depending on where they are. So it's a holiday, like all big events, that meet people in different life scenarios in very different ways, and it's always a good idea just to keep our eyes open and be sensitive to that. I think that piece is always significant. I just want to say, if I can go back to my my junk food scrooginess, that I think I will say with a real gratitude to our communities that there has been a real improvement.
Yeah,
people are much more aware of not wanting to, also the waste that's involved. And when it's close to Shabbat, making it, bread and wine or things that really are going to be used, right, in everyone's home.
It's fun us when you get like real food, like
totally
soup, or
I get like salatim, lots of salatim. I get with like beautiful homemade bread. I just want to say, like, I'm really grateful for that shift. I don't see that as much with the kids among their friends.
That's how it's fun for them.
Exactly, but I think that has shifted, and there's again more of an awareness of waste, and also an awareness of like, I don't think any of us want this in our home for the next month.
Pesach is coming.
And Pesach is coming. So I really appreciate that shift that at least I've seen in the communities that I've lived in.
I remember as a kid, my mother would be like, Pesach is coming. And like when you're a kid, a month is like forever. So like, Pesach is coming, that's not for forever. But then when you're, an adult and you're actually thinking about ridding your house and starting to, it's like, yeah, Pesach is not so far away. I think one of the key elements in everything that you're saying is that both men and women are obligated in the Mitzvot of Purim. So what's important for me is that when plans are being made, everyone's like halachic and spiritual needs should be taken into account, which I find to be sometimes particularly challenging around the Seuda, because on Purim there's this obligation to have a big holiday meal known as a Seuda or Mishcha, as you said, which usually understood that it's going to involve also meat and drinking wine, since, as you said, there are elements of the holiday that are echoing like the Shavalim and the Hagim. And already in the Megilla, we're told that the Jews celebrated the canceling of Haman's decree and the fact that they were given permission to fight against their enemies by making Yom Mishta V'Simcha, like a day of feasting and rejoicing. The challenge of the Seuda, I guess there's a few of them, but one is that the Seuda on Purim has become heavily associated with drinking, not just like drinking wine, but like really, getting drunk. And I want to clarify like why that's so, and maybe how we could put it into proper perspective. The Gemara in Masechet Megilla states that one should drink ad lo yada, that one should drink until they are not able to differentiate between Mordechai, like the good guy, and Haman, the bad guy. Now, it's interesting why that's even so. Like, is this because v'na folchu, that we have this idea in Purim of like things turning upside down, or is it because we want to like go back to like a very like pashut understanding of the world. Like sometimes people think like, we're so sophisticated today and life is so complex that sometimes like when you drink, you just got to like the basics and like see things as they are. Whatever it is, there are some poskim like the Shulchan Aruch who quote this line from the Gemara like verbatim that yes, someone should drink until they don't know the difference between Mordechai and Taman, which is a lot of drinking. Whereas other poskim like the Ramah, the Ashkenazi posik, translate the statement into something more measured. They say there's requirement to drink more than you usually would, and then you'll get a little bit drowsy and you'll go to sleep, and when you're asleep you can't distinguish between Mordechai and Haman, and that's a fulfillment of this idea, but that you don't have to actually become drunk. And it could be that part of the reason that he's wary of that is because the follow-up story in the Gemara is about these two rabbis who had the Purim Seuda together and got so drunk that one of them ended up killing the other. And that's why we see that this idea of like whether you should drink and how much you should drink and should you actually get drunk is actually never resolved. There's different authorities who take different opinions. And the Ramah states that really the main thing is echad hamarba, the echad hamamid, ubavad shechavin libo l'shamayim. That whatever you're doing, your intentions should be pure and your intention should be based on like what you think is right in terms of your service of Hashem, which means that this isn't just an opportunity to like experiment with alcohol or to drink. It's supposed to be that you have in mind, something that's spiritual and something that has to do with your avodat Hashem. And it could be that one of the reasons also that we think that drinking is an element of Purim is because, as the Bir Halacha, the Mishnah Berurah explains, so many of the events in the Megilla happen around feasts where there was drinking taking place. So whether it was, the disposal of Vashti and Esther being introduced into the story, or the Seuda, the feast that Esther invites Achashverosh and Haman to, which leads to Haman's downfall. But I think that what's important for us here is to really focus on what it is that we're trying to accomplish if we are going to be involved with some drinking. Okay, first of all, let me just make it clear that anyone who thinks that there's requirement to drink thinks that it's only during the daytime. It says Yemei, Yemei Mishcha v'Simcha, which is the days of feasting and drinking, and not at night. There's absolutely no mitzvah to drink at night. And we know that a lot of drinking happens at night. So someone could say, because that's like in the spirit of the day or whatever, but there's no mitzvah. If there is a mitzvah, there's no mitzvah to drink at night. And then specifically with women, it's also a little bit more complicated because there's a passage in the Gemara that cautions against women drinking heavily in general. So it could be also that that's why we don't see women as much, feeling this obligation to drink. I'll talk about myself personally for a minute, just to say that where I grew up, like in the 80s and 90s in America, first of all, drinking in the communities that I was a part of was like associated with like irresponsible decision-making and inappropriate behavior. And it was like, if you were a good kid, then like you stayed away from that. Like it had very negative associations for me growing up and as a teenager. And also in my specific home, my father, like he always made Kaddish on grape juice. He doesn't really like wine. So it was a big deal that on Pesach, we broke out the Kedem Kal, 3.5% alcohol for the Dalet Kosod, for the 4 cups of wine, or that on Purim, we had Moscato, 5% alcohol. So for me, I didn't grow up with this idea of like drinking on Purim, but for a lot of people, it really is a very significant, and I want to even say meaningful part of the day.
Yeah, also because some people, Shayna, find that when they drink, it brings them to like a spiritual place or an unhindered place, but an unhindered, not to them being inappropriate, but in like a place of being open also like spiritually and saying the right Torah and to access something inside that they wouldn't access normally.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to talk about, which is that when I made Aliyah, for the first time, I really understood this idea of like nichnas yayin yatsa sod, that when you drink a little bit of wine, sometimes secrets come out, in the sense of that wine, as you just said, like it could allow us to break through some of those barriers and protective layers and defenses that we put up because we don't want to be vulnerable, or we don't want to think about what's really important to us in life, or sometimes it's hard for people to be totally authentic or totally genuine. And sometimes when people drink with the right mindset, it could be very powerful because it allows them to connect to these deeper parts of themselves. And, Megillah, like we'll see students crying about their avodat Hashem or about their aspirations in life or about what it is that they really want. I specifically have never really gotten junk because I like control, and I think I'm like scared of like what's going to happen now if I drink. But there's something that I admire about people that are able to let go a little bit. The risk always is that it should be done in good taste, and it should be done in good measure, and it should be done appropriately. And I think it's actually a wonderful opportunity to speak to our children and to our students about what that means. Like, how do you drink if you're going to drink in a way that you don't end up feeling sick, in a way that you're not throwing up, in a way that you're able to function? Because if that happens, then you're not going to be able to connect to anything meaningful, or if you're totally out cold. So what does it mean to drink responsibly, and how do you make good decisions? And do you know like which things can't be mixed together? And what's your plan afterwards for like how you're going to get to where you need to go? Because obviously you want to make sure that you're not driving. And if it's at night, will you be able to get up in the morning and hear Megilla? All these kinds of things. And what I'll just say is that when I've seen this done well, and I've seen it done well with, like, let's say groups of women who get together either at night for some kind of celebration or to make their own Seuda. And you see that the kinds of singing or the dancing or the divrei Torah that are flowing or their ability to connect to each other and express themselves authentically is something that could be very, very, very special. You just have to think in advance about how to do that. And
who to do it with.
And that's what I was just going to say. Oh, who to do it with. Yeah. And also, and I wanted to say for all the women that are listening who don't necessarily have an opportunity to have, that's not the stage of life that they're at, to have like a women's only Seuda or something like that, then just to think about, so in the context of my family, are there ways in which, I could feel this meaningful spiritual connection? Is it through what we do with our kids? Or if I'm a young married couple and all my husband's friends are coming over and I enjoy that and I enjoy seeing their singing and their divrei Torah or whatever, but will I feel like I have a place? So as long as people think about it in advance and they make sure that their expectations are in check, I think that goes a long way.
I think, by the way, an opportunity could be at night, not even in terms of whether they drink or not, but I've seen it. I remember when I lived in Yerucham, we have this both of those years, but that at night there was like a women's gathering, and it was nice because it wasn't instead of something for the family. Like anyways, the little kids either were going to sleep or big kids aren't around, or do you know what I'm saying? It wasn't like on anyone else's time.
They have a lot here.
Yeah, there's a lot of the nighttime gathering that could be separate. You and I both end up going to Megillah at night, so we're in that space. But I think it's really nice as a community. Like I've seen it happening more and more, and that could be like a nice setting. I will say that just to speak about the Seuda, meaning the daytime meal, that I remember in the years before I was married, so a few times I went to like an all-women's Seuda, and I found that really, really nice because, it was just much more freeing, and we could do what we want, and
it's comfortable.
Everyone's comfortable, and you just feel, it's just a really nice environment. And I think that's a lovely idea if that's relevant for someone in their stage of life. I'll also just say I actually can't really drink alcohol. It makes me horrifically sick. And my husband doesn't drink alcohol. He has no taste for it. I happen to love wine. I grew up totally in a home with alcohol, but I have no tolerance for it because I'm allergic to one of the ingredients in it. But so it's totally not part of our Purim. Like we'll drink a little bit for Purim and, for the, maybe the mitzvah that there is. But it's totally not a feature. And I will say that when it comes to if you do have a Seuda with couples together, it's something that I think very seriously about. I'm usually at Seudot that there's not drinking where people get drunk. But if I was going to go to a Seuda, and people will say that before, say, do you want to come? Just know he gets drunk. Like, I would think very carefully about what environment I want to put myself in, especially when it's a mixed environment of men and women. Like, I want to feel comfortable, and I want all of us to feel comfortable. And that everything's
appropriate.
Yeah, and that things are appropriate. So those are definitely things that I put thought into. But as personally, as a family, it's not as relevant for us.
What's your actual Seuda like?
Our actual Seuda, again, this year and last year, we ate it with two different couples, and honestly, we put a lot of emphasis on games, on sort of content, on making it fun for the kids, and in general, I'm in charge of content, like meaning at our meals on Shabbat also, and So I have like a file on my computer that I add to every year of like little riddles, chidonim, and different games, and depending on ages, etc. So we do a lot more of that kind of content. Definitely make sure that there's Divrei Torah. Thankfully, and with our friends last year and this year, like everyone provides those Divrei Torah. So that's definitely a part of it. But I would say that to me, what's also fun and special, because it's not so much the drinking piece, is the fact that you're sitting down for like an appropriate chag meal on a Yom Chol.
Yeah.
Like there's something, because when we talk about sacred time in Yahadut, so there's something interesting when we have that sacred time in a day that you do malacha. It's just different, like qualitatively, than what we often have. So that's cool. Like I think that it adds a different
music.
Yeah, you could put music, you could drive there. Like there's something that is freeing about it. I really appreciate what the strictures of Isur Malacha create in most of our Sudot that do happen on times when we can't do Malacha, but there's something interesting about that.
It also always reminds me of the Seuda Mafseket on Erev Yom Kippur, which, we say there's a connection between like Purim and Yom Kippurim, and there's something about having that meal in the late afternoon when it's not actually a chag, and it's like, people are running around or the phones are there or whatever. Like, it's like this in-between kind of feeling, and it also furthers the connection between those 2 days. At our own Purim Seuda, like we do have alcohol, but it's not that people get so drunk. It's not really about that. It's also not so much about the content in terms of like the Divrei Torah or the games as much as it's about the atmosphere. I feel like in my home, like we really try to sing a lot and to dance a lot and to put on music or to have live music. If you have different relatives that play the guitar or things like that, the piano, and also, and I remember the first year that my parents were in Aliyah, this was a big surprise for them because it was different than how I grew up. We also tried to tap into that more serious and deeper aspects of Purim, exactly what I said, Purim being kind of like similar to Yom Kippur as a time of like tefillah, as a time of real prayer and hope that Hashem is going to send us salvation and that he's going to turn events around. So we do sing a lot of slow songs, which when my parents first came, they're like, what is going on here? This is a happy day. And we're like, no, but like, just like on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur here in Israel, there's often some happy singing. So also on Purim here, there's often some
there's a heavy
low,
yeah,
heavy singing, and specifically 2 songs that move me all the time, like the song of Im hachareish tachareishi, which I didn't know these songs in America, but like the song where Mordechai says to Esther, like, if you stay silent at this time, like like salvation is going to come to them from another place, but like that salvation's going to come. So there's a beautiful, beautiful tune to that. And also the song of Im matzati chen beinecha melech, which there's a slow one and a fast one, but this idea of that Esther, is talking to Achashverosh, but really she's talking to Hashem, that if I have found favor in your eyes, then please, tinatin li nafshi b'shelati, then please, give us our lives and make sure that, that you're looking out for us. So I think all of these, to wrap it up, like all these 3 mitzvot that we spoke about, the Matanot of La-evyonim and Mishloach Manot and the the Seuda, could really have very significant, meaningful elements to them if we think about how we want to bring that out.
Totally.
Now on to Megilla.
On to Megillah. Okay, so this is our 4th mitzvah of the Chag, and definitely one that gets a lot of airtime, and in terms of women's involvement in recent decades also, and we'll get there. Now, the mitzvah of Megillah is reading the whole Megillah on Purim night and again on Purim day, and the idea is Persume Nisa, is to publicize the miracle that was Purim. The people who listen to the Megillah are essentially, there's a halachic mechanism, which is called shomea kekore, that he or she who hears is also like one who reads. And that means that we're able to fulfill our mitzvah by listening to somebody else reading it. Now, women are obligated in the Megillah, as we said before, even though it's a time-bound mitzvah, but because of Afen Hayubo Tohanes, that they're obligated in this mitzvah as well. I will just say, and this is going to be significant for us, that the Tosefta exempts women from the mitzvah. And the Bahag on that Tosefta explains that the exemption is from reading it, but they still have to hear it. In terms of, who has to be there, so on one hand, we want Berov Am Hadrat Melech, that there should be a lot of people, but we don't have to have a minyan. It doesn't have to be a quorum of 10 men, but definitely having 10 or more people is preferred in order to really fulfill that idea as there being a lot of people. I'll just say that you have to hear every word. So if there's a preference for there being a smaller group of people, if you'll be able to hear everything. I mean, if you go to somewhere and there's 1 million people and that might be really moving, but you can't actually hear the Megillah, that's not halachah.
We have to keep both of those.
Yes, you have to keep
in our
both those in mind.
Because the idea of Berov Am is really that the more people that are there, the bigger glorification it is of God's name. And the whole idea here is to publicize the miracle and to thank God. It's also interesting because we don't say Hallel on Purim. And some people say it's because the Megillah is the Hallel. Like, it is the praise of God. It is the way that we publicize this miracle.
Yes, totally. So we just said before that there is a special hidur, or sort of the better way to read Megillah is Berov Am, there being a lot of people there. And there's a debate among different Rishonim and then Achronim about who these 10 people, what's the ideal makeup of these 10 people. So first opinion is, well, usually we do 10. 10 means 10 men. It's a quorum, so it should be 10 men. Another approach says that it could perfectly well be 10 women, but it should be 10 women alone, meaning not a mixed group of men and women, with a concern of propriety, etc. And then another approach which says that no, it can be a mixed group of men and women, because as we said, they're obligated in publicizing the miracle. And so those are 3 different approaches. The Ramah, who's our Ashkenazi authority, leaves us as a matter of doubt. And while he leaves it like that, there's a range of authorities that count women alone as really this quorum of this group of 10 people, and say that indeed also the final bracha can be made in the
final bracha has to do with multitudes of people.
Exactly. And I also just want to stop here and comment, because a few episodes ago when we spoke about communal prayer, I was speaking about the idea of really encouraging women to see themselves as a group, right? Whether it's a Berov Am, right? Or some sort of counting, right? In general. And I think this is a really, really great example of that. And while that group of 10 doesn't enable us to say Dvarim Shebekdusha, right? Whether it's, Kaddish or Baruch Hu, etc., that our presence, right? Even as the only members of the 10 has significance. And Megillat Esther is a great example of that.
Which leads to readings that are only for women.
Yes, exactly. And that becomes a question. So if women, right, if a group of 10 women also counts as the Berov Am, so can women just read for other women?
Or before that even, let's talk about, can a man read for a group of just women, and say the brachot? Or could a woman read for herself?
Yes. And so the Gemara teaches us that women are fit to read, meaning they are able to read the Megillah. And the early authorities suggest that that this actually could be read as referring to reading for other women who have the same obligation. It's already there quite from the beginning of the conversation. It's not like a new trend or fad in terms of the idea of it. And so that's a significant piece, because we often think about it as a very modern practice, but we also have in the Yerushalmi and Masechet Megillah, it also sounds like there were readings for women that were separate, meaning it was a man reading for a group of women.
I mean, this idea of that women weren't maybe at the big reading in shul and they were having their own meetings, that goes back a long time.
A long time.
Because you can understand women, especially if they were home with the kids and they had to hear Megillah afterwards, so they had their own separate reading afterwards. But as many of us know from the communities that we grew up in, like traditionally that's a group of women with like one man reading, and that we see, even the Yerushalmi seems to say that was happening in people's homes.
Yeah, and this is all parallel conversations of the question of women reading for other women, which we're going to get to in a moment. But we have here sources that already spoke about, whether it's the Yerushalmi, we also have the Aruch HaShulchan, that often recognize that the shul setting wasn't always the best. It could be loud or noisier. Obviously, if there's kids around and it's hard to hear every word.
Or the women's section is far, or the mechitza is not so great.
Yeah,
or you can't really hear sometimes.
You can't hear so well. So the idea that a man might come and read for only women, that's an idea that we see already going pretty far back.
Yeah. And then, given everything that you just shared and explained, I want to now go into the issue of women reading for other women, because there's 2 real halachic reasons why some object to that idea. The first is that some hold that a woman really needs to be hearing Megillah read by a man. So she shouldn't even be reading Megillah for herself, and certainly shouldn't be reading Megillah for other women. So that's one concern. And the other halachic concern is that there are some who hold that a woman reading publicly for other women in general is maybe considered undignified or not the best way to be doing, be doing this act. But on both of those points, there's a lot of debate, and there are many poskim who just don't share those concerns, which we could understand. So then there's also 2 other issues that people raise when it comes to women reading for other women. One is a very technical uncertainty say about which bracha a woman should recite. And the other is a broader concern that if we go back to that idea of Berov Am Hajat Melach, that the greater number of people there is, the more we maximize the potential of like God's name being glorified. So separating out the women from the community and them having their own reading for themselves, some people think is like gonna, affect that feeling of like the whole community coming out together. And there are definitely many halachic authorities who strongly prefer that this really be like a community experience, that all men and all women and all children go and hear the Megillah read together by a man in the Beit Knesset. But there are other sources that really leave a good amount of room for women to be able to read Megillah for other women. So you already mentioned the Yerushalmi and the Aruch HaShulchan, who bring up the fact that women's readings in terms of women on their own were already happening, or that this concern that the Aruch HaShulchan mentions about not being able to hear well, and like that being something that maybe should take precedence over the idea of Berov Am. And there are also just poskim who think that there is no real halachic preference that a woman has to be hearing the Megillah read in a shul as opposed to somewhere else. And I think especially like when we know that there's often second readings that are smaller, and anyway, a woman's not going to be at the big main communal reading. So then if she's going to be going to something else anyway, so then maybe it shouldn't, matter. That could be another reason to support women reading for other women. In any case, on a very practical level, what I'll say is that Rav Aharon Lichtenstein, who is the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Tzion and was very, a big Talmid Chacham and a posek, he was known to permit women's Megillah readings at institutions of women's Torah study. So when you have a midrashah setting or a Beit Midrash setting or a women's high school or something like that, where women are used to learning together and davening together, and they spend sometimes Shabbatot together or even Chagim together. So he felt like it's very pashut, it's very simple in that case that women should be able then to celebrate this Chag together and to read the Megillah, to each other. It's unclear, though. We don't know what he would say about circumstances where they're not part of a women's institution, and we're talking about a community. And then we don't know if he would have said everyone should be at one big reading, or if anyway there's a larger, second reading, then people should go to that. And we don't know if he would have said in that case that he would have agreed that it's okay for women to make their own reading. But his son and successor as the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Tzion, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, has written explicitly that he believes that women's readings, even in the context of a synagogue, he thinks are a fulfillment of this idea of Berov Am Hajat Melech, and he takes a very positive view on women's readings. And one of the things that really speaks to me about what he wrote about this is that he said that in a day and age where there are so many women who really sincerely to be Ovdod Hashem, and they really are looking for channels to be able to come close to Hashem and to express that connection, when we have an avenue of worship that is permitted halachically, when there's so many others that we know are not, then he says this is an opportunity, especially because we know Chazal say lasot nachat ruach l'nashim, that to help women feel gratified, like in their spiritual service. So he thinks that that is a reason to support this and to encourage this, which I very much appreciate, that when there is halachic room and a posek is willing to say this is halachically okay, and we want to encourage women to be able to, step up and to be able to be involved in something, that they're willing to support that means a lot to me. And it's also easier then for me to respect the boundaries that they put down, because it's like I know that they're there kind of supporting and advocating for women when there's halachic room. And then when they say, okay, but this is the line, so then it's easier, to accept that. And I'll just say that I just feel really blessed and privileged that we live in a generation where in many, many communities, women have a range of halachically sanctioned options for Megillah reading, and that every woman could really decide what factors to take into account when she's choosing where to hear Megillah. So for some, it's going to be very technical, like what's the timing of the different readings and how do I balance that with my other personal responsibilities? And for some people, it's going to be completely based on spiritual factors. Where will I be most inspired? Where will I most connect to the reading? Some women specifically love going to shul and they love hearing the Megillah with the entire community. and, being in the same room as their spouse or as their children, and other people find it harder to hear, or shul in general is not necessarily an environment where they feel 100% comfortable. So I really feel like it's great that there's so many different options. And if you're a woman that's content, like our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, hearing the Megillah read in shul, so that's great. And if you're a woman who prefers to attend a women's reading, either as a listener or as a reader herself, because especially it's a story about women, and you feel like hearing the Megillah read in women's voices really, really, really accentuates that aspect. And this is an opportunity to take more of a leading role. So then I think that it's incredible that we live in a generation where that is an option. And I'll just say about myself that I've always loved the Megillah, since I'm a kid, and especially when the person reading, and we had someone like this in Great Neck where I grew up, really put in a little bit more emphasis and read with a little bit more feeling and drama than just a regular parsha, Kriyat HaTorah. And therefore, when we lived in America, I was very content going to shul, and I never searched out anything different. I never went to a women's reading. But when we made Aliyah and I experienced the women's Megillah reading in Migdalos for the first time, I was blown away. I remember how moved I was. I remember the tears in my eyes. It was really quite something to be there. And if I could try to capture it, it was the mix of first of all, the readers had beautiful voices and they read slowly, and it was totally silent and everyone was listening. And there wasn't this feeling of let's just get this over so that we could go back and break our fast. And how much effort went into preparing. And you knew that none of those women reading took it for granted, that it was obvious that they had this opportunity. And there was just something really, really, really powerful about that, specifically because it's Megillat Esther, and there's so much emphasis on the role that Esther played in this, that hearing that story read in these beautiful female voices was something that, since I experienced that, I usually, and continue to hear the women's reading in Megillas at night, and then in the morning, it depends kind of what works with our schedule for the day.
Yeah, I think I want to respond both to the communal piece and then also on a personal level. I find it very interesting, and this is only reflective of the worlds that I'm floating in. I don't pretend to think that it's representative of the broader Jewish world. But what I have noticed is that where in the places I have lived, that even women who like to stay away from things that have a feminist reputation to them, you have many more women who will lean into going to a women's reading than they'll lean into other practices. We'll leave that without names, okay? But other practices. So you have many more women. And I think that part of it, Shayna, is that piece you've brought now, which is there's something intuitive about Megillat Esther being read by a woman, meaning it's a story about a woman. And I'll just say that, interestingly, the inroads that Megillat Esther has made in communities over the past decades, where I live, there's women readings of Echa and also of Ruth, meaning it's gone into other Megillot as well, which I don't think is the same idea, but I just have noticed women who will come to the women's readings where I live, but they are not at all supportive of other kinds of practices. So I find that piece to be interesting. There's something inherent, I think, or just intuitive about the feminine element of this mitzvah.
And also because halachically we really see that there's a lot of understanding by many people.
Yeah, no, it's much less complex. Yeah, it's halachically much less complex than some of the other practices.
It's a mix of those two.
Yeah, it's a mix of those. I will just say on a personal level that, yeah, I've been going to women's readings. I also read at them for a very long time. As you're speaking, I'm trying to remember when I started, but I can't remember anymore.
And Israel?
I don't remember.
Wow.
I don't remember anymore if I started in the States or here. It definitely was since I've been living in Israel. So that means it's basically 20 years, but I can't remember anymore when it started. And I will say that when I started attending and also reading at women's readings, it definitely for me started this for me what was a redeeming of a lot of Purim, which, as I said, many elements of it are not natural to my personality, but for me it was a very meaningful part of Purim for me, and it was very helpful. I'll say a flip side of it, which is really weird, because you would think that as time goes on and you read more so you're more comfortable. I find that as time has gone on, I get more nervous to read. Yeah. So there have been years where I've chosen not to read because I feel like it was too much pressure. And this year, I'm reading 2 more Prakim than usual, and I haven't even started practicing yet, but hopefully I'll be on my game by the time you hear this episode. which really makes me nervous. And like I decide each year, like, do I want to just read something that I could read, in my sleep because I know it really well? Or do I take on a challenge? Like it takes on
like to read. I think women don't always appreciate how much
it's really
learning
hard.
may have.
Yeah.
Whether it's the Parsha or Megilla or.
Yeah, and I would say also there are many men who don't like reading. Like it's a big challenge. Like it's a lot to remember. And anyway, so for me it is meaningful, and sometimes it's nerve-wracking, and I make a choice about like, I'm always going to go to them, but I did make a choice about how much I'm going to read.
Mm-hmm.
So that for me is sort of like an obvious, and I will say that like also having my daughters come like is significant. Like they were
special.
Yeah, so and I've also made it clear to them that it's important for me that they be there, because I remember there were some years where like they didn't come and they're just like, no, we'll just go with Abba as the main reading, and I was like, no, I want you to be with me. So that piece is significant. And I'll also just say, by the way, that I also have the option of going to Migdalos, but I feel it's really important to strengthen the reading in my community. So I don't go because I want to be present and be able to contribute where I live.
I hear that. I asked if you started reading in America or in Israel because I find that this is one of those areas that, because in Israel, people aren't looking over their shoulder of like whether their orthodoxy is too similar to conservative or Reform Judaism, that sometimes that has facilitated women being able to take on more, involvement.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, there's always still somewhat, more of that concern. Although in America, also more and more, I hear about different women's readings happening in the communities.
Another piece that's really significant is that most communal structures here don't have a rabbi. And so it's very easy to just have a grassroots, hey, we're having a reading, come and sign up. Like it's a WhatsApp group.
Passed by anybody.
Yeah, there's no one. Yeah, video. There's different sides to that.
Two specific things I wanted to say about the Megillah. One is that I am so connected to the story, and I think that one of the reasons why is I grew up on these cassettes. There were these yellow cassettes called the Purim Story. That's how it opens, and it was like this audio.
Show notes.
Yes, it's this audio dramatized version of the events of Megillah where every character has a different voice, and they really make the story come alive. And we would listen to it like year after year in my childhood home, and it was funny and it was moving, and it really brought to life a lot of the midrashim that are found in Masechet Megillah, and it just made it all so real. And to this day, like I brought it to my children, and even though my kids are all grown up, we all need to listen to it every year. And anyone who grew up on these like knows what I'm talking about. So I would highly recommend just checking it out, because there's something that just like totally is captivating and brings you all in. And in terms of something a little bit deeper on the Megillah that I just want to share very quickly is a point that I read years ago in an article from Rav Aharon Lichtenstein that I'll also link to, that just like really moves me. And every year I share this with my students, or I bring it up at the Purim Seuda, which relates to Esther herself, because this Megillah is called Megillat Esther. It could be called Megillat Mordechai or something else, but it's called Megillat Esther. And I really think it's because of this amazing, incredible, magnificent transformation that Esther, the character, goes through, which is that she, at the beginning of the Megillah, seems very passive, like very, kind of like following what everybody else is saying, but not thinking on her own, not being assertive, not thinking about what she wants to say. And then there's this huge change that takes place, and all of a sudden she's super assertive, and she's the one calling the shots, and she's running around, and she's meeting with the king, and she's inviting him to parties, and she's coming up with ideas, and she's telling Mordechai to go out and gather the Jews and to have them fast for her. And she really, really, really takes initiative. And this switch happens in Perek Dalet. It happens in the 4th chapter of the Megillah, where Mordechai comes and tells her about what's going on in this decree of Haman, and tells her to go to the king, and she doesn't really want to. And then he says to her this line, do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. And then he says, on the contrary, if you're silent, then salvation will come to the Jews from another place, while you and your father's house will perish. And after that, immediately, Esther says, okay, lech knos kol yudim, go and gather everyone and fast on my behalf, and I'm going to go to the king. And when I teach this in Migdalos, I always ask the students, guys, what was it? Like, what was it about that exchange with Mordechai that affected and impacted her so deeply that we see this like major character change? It is not easy to like change who we are, at our core and like the root our nature and our personality. Like, what happened here? And they always offer, amazing answers, really like insightful things. Like, is it that Esther didn't realize what was going on and she didn't know like how awful the situation was outside? She was sheltered in the palace, and only once she heard from Mordecai does she like realize, the gravity of the situation. Is it that she doesn't have self-confidence, and it's only when Mordecai believes in her and he's like this father figure that she realizes like she could do something about this? Is it that she was busy wallowing in self-pity, like, oh, I'm a victim, I'm a miskina, stuck here in this awful situation, and Mordecai comes and empowers her and says, you have a mission, like, miyodeim le'ekazot, higat lemachut, like, who knows if it's for this moment, that you've been in this situation. So all of those, are very, very possible. But what Rav Lichtenstein says is that it could be that Esther was neither oblivious or lacking self-confidence or a sense of purpose, but she was actually apathetic. That's what he says, that maybe she was complacent, that Mordecai comes and says, you have to do something. She's like, no, I can't do something. I wasn't called. And if I go, I could be killed. And he's like, are you kidding me? Like, the whole Jewish people are about to be killed. Our lives are on the line. Like, you think you're going to escape that? Like, he's calling her out on something pretty extreme. Like, he's telling her what, you don't care? Or like, you think you're going to save yourself in the palace? And I almost feel like it's this moment where basically Esther has to face herself, like someone's holding up a mirror to her and saying, you're telling me that we all have our lives on the line and like, you're not going to do anything because you're worried about risking your life. And she has to look deep inside herself and think about like, am I going to make excuses, or am I going to step up and take responsibility? And am I going to like actually lean into this and stop hiding? And I think a lot of times in our life, like we have moments like that where like we're making all different kinds of excuses and someone says, for real? Like, for real? And then you have this opportunity to be like, wow, like, am I going to make this huge paradigm shift and say, I've been kind of like feeding myself all these stories, but like, no, I forget it. I have to cut through all that, and I could do something different. And she steps up and she makes that significant transformation. And the reason that I love this explanation is because on the one hand, it's like you read the Purim story and you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, sit around and like pray that God saves us, like it's kind of like out of our control. But then when you hear an explanation you're like this, you're like, wait, actually, what Rav Lichtenstein is saying is that in the end, as much as our salvation and Yeshua is dependent on God, we also each have a responsibility in the role that we play to bring that geula, and especially living here in Israel in our time and knowing like what it means to step up and take responsibility and not feed yourself stories and to, lean in. To me, like that message of Rav Lichtenstein is so powerful because he's saying it's not only about God's role, it's also about what we bring to this. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember, that we have a role to play here.
I think another level, by the way, to that explanation is important to also not ignore where the story is taking place, because the story is taking place outside of Israel, and when you are subject to the sovereignty of the government of another nation, so your sense of sort of giving up like control or my ability to effectuate change is even, I would say, is even more natural. Like I think it's more natural to go
what do you
that
want
direction.
From me?
Exactly.
What could I do?
I'm just the pawn here. And I would say that if you want to bring that into like a modern Israeli setting, we don't have that. We don't even have the privilege to think that, because you don't have that ability. Like if it's not us, then it's no one. So I would say it's like the story of Esther on steroids almost. So I think that piece also comes up there, and the location of the Megillah is a whole nother conversation. But one other thing that I often think about, I think for me is one of the most moving ideas I've ever read about women in Tanakh, and I find a lot of different ways to bring it into teaching in different spaces, is there's this wonderful, wonderful doctoral thesis that was written by a woman named Edva Hilvitz in Hebrew. And she writes in her doctorate about what she calls it a genre of the woman who saves life, okay? It's called Isha Metzilat Chaim. And she counts 26 women. Some of them have stories about them. Some of them are mentioned in one pasuk, but 26 women in Tanakh who their role is to save life. It could be their child. It could be someone else's child. In the case of Esther, it's Am Yisrael, right? I mean, it's a community of Jews. It's not her own children. And there are a bunch of really, really moving connecting points between all of those stories. That's why she calls it like a genre, meaning it's a sort of like a story type that appears in many places. First is that the women are always successful in the stories, whereas we have men who try and save lives. And by the way, some of them don't succeed. Ruvain, and we have other examples like that. The women always succeed. And I'll say that in at least 13 of the stories, the women are the main character. But interestingly, by the end of the story, she disappears. She disappears either completely, like in the case of Esther, right? She's not in the 10th chapter of the Megillah, or in some of the stories, she goes back to what her sort of like status as like the secondary figure in the story, meaning like she did a thing.
Up and then
exactly.
she goes back.
She goes back and then she retreats to either she's not part of the story anymore, or she goes back to what she was before. Bathsheba is also an example of this in the beginning of Sefer Melachim. So this is a really, I think, really interesting way to look at also Esther. Because she gets up, right, from Perek Dal, as you said. She does her thing. She saves the day, and they enact the holiday, right? And Mordechai tries initially by himself, and then he really needs Esther's stamp of approval. That's in the 9th chapter. And then in the 10th chapter, she's not there anymore. And we really think about, and the story ends with Mordechai and his stand in the eyes of the Jewish people. And what happens in this is that you basically have this idea that at least the way that the story is telling the biblical story is telling their story, is that they had a function to fulfill. And once the function was fulfilled, they retreated back to what they were doing
like
before.
A moment in time.
Yeah. And it's exactly what Mordechai says to Esther. He says, like, this, the et hazot higat, right? It's for this moment. Like, your life is going to continue. You're going to continue living in Beit Hanashim in Achashverosh's palace. But this is your moment to do your thing. And I thought about this a lot in Israel in the past. And the truth is, it started a long time ago. I think Miriam Peretz was a real first example of this. But you have a lot of women, and unfortunately, a lot of it is, yes, on the heels of tragedy and loss, totally. And you also have women who do many amazing things, and it could not be connected to loss. But I think about this idea specifically of coming to the front of center stage and then retreating. And it's dafka bin in these kinds of moments.
And also not necessarily having chosen to be there. Like,
totally not chosen.
Events throwing you into
and then they made a choice to be like, okay, this is the moment. So I'm going to use this moment to make that, to use this as a stage to move that cause forward. And yes, a lot of this, again, was in very, very negative circumstances. But also that there was a very overt, some of them even wrote articles to say, I am retreating, meaning my moment was, and now I'm moving back. I don't want to be in that space anymore. But it's something that I really carry with me, just in general, looking at biblical women. It's not the only thing that biblical women do, right, through all the Tanakh, but it is very much what we see happening with Esther. Like that burst out to the scene. It's a 3-month story, right? And then we don't know what happens in the end. We don't know what happens in the rest of the story. But that, I think, is really powerful, that sometimes we have circumstances that push us to a moment. I mean, we obviously have to choose it, as you just said before. We have to decide that we're taking an opportunity, but circumstance happens, and then we choose where we place ourselves in that story. And it doesn't have to be forever. It could be that we have a mission to fulfill, again, men and women, and then we pull back to where we were before, because that's where we want to actually spend our time. So I just think that idea of like the coming to the front and retreating back is something that I really often think about when it comes to Esther.
Yeah, and there's so many women, as you said, over the last 2 years who, mothers of hostages or spouses, or women who lost their husbands or whatever, who really, in all their grief and all their sorrow, chose to kind of, make something bigger.
Yeah.
Or step into certain...
And make it about Am Yisrael and not about their individual stories, which is exactly the Esther story.
Yeah. All right. This has actually gotten me very excited for Purim now. I came in feeling a little bit like, well, what? It's like almost here. And now like, okay, bring it on. I think it's good. It's good to talk about some of the positive energy of this Chag and like the ideas that are, really there, right beneath the surface or even above the surface. And as a takeaway, I think what I want to focus on, kind of walking away from this conversation, which is ironic because I now was focusing on like the human element, and you were also just focusing now on like, people feeling empowered and making decisions and doing whatever. But I want to step back for a second and also go back to the God element here. And there's 2 points specifically on my mind. One is that even though Hashem is hidden in the Megillah and we know his name doesn't appear even once, we know that he was with us the entire time, so to speak, behind the scenes, watching out for us and pulling the strings and making sure that events played out in the way that would benefit the Jewish people, and especially in the crazy times that we're living with. And we've been for a month now kind of living with this Iran, thread in the background, and who knows what will even
Sunny with
be.
a chance of missile.
Who knows what will be by the time this is aired? But like, we're in crazy times, and that idea of like, but Hashem's with us is so reassuring and calming to me, and I just always try to go back there. And second, which is connected to this, is the idea of v'nafuchu, that God, if he wants to, can turn things around in an instant. He could turn things on his head. Yeshua Hashem keref ayin. God's salvation can happen in the blink of an eye. But we have to do our part. And when Esther comes and she says tachareishi, but really to Hashem, im matzati chen beinecha melech, if I have found favor, we need to do our part to find favor in the eyes of Hashem. And Shnizkeh, God willing, will be worthy for the same kind of Yeshua that are dramatic and happen instantaneously, and halavai.
I think we've also seen a whole bunch of them in the past 2 years. There's been those mornings where you wake up and you're like, am I still living in the same world?
Yeah, exactly. What about you? What's your takeaway?
Yeah, I think I wanna just go back to some of the earlier pieces that I brought up about looking at Purim and sort of also because it's a Yom Chol, meaning it's a Chag on a regular day without Isur Melacha, that we have a lot of elements of choice of how we kind of craft our holiday. And I want to just emphasize that piece that we have, 4 main mitzvot of the day, and there's many avenues of creativity. And there's, the question of like Megilla reading and what kind of Megilla reading, or it's Megilla reading with more voices, less voices, whoever reads it, man or woman. I think that there's a lot of choices that we can make in order to make the holiday more meaningful for us. And I think that often what it just takes is a little bit of thinking before the holiday, which connects to the, who are we going to have our Seuda with? And I think that I want to just encourage us all to, sit down, maybe have a 20-minute conversation, and think about how we want to go about this day so it doesn't just kind of like hit us. And then it's because when you start running on Purim, it goes really fast. Like it's just one day. So it kind of, sometimes it has that overwhelm of like all these mitzvot and all the things I have to do and but if we think about it beforehand, then we can like enter into those moments intentionally. And it's very hard to do that in the actual moment. So I think I just want to encourage everyone to take that time to think about it and see how can I make Purim more meaningful and focus on the messages and even highlighting some of the mitzvot that I think are going to make this holiday more meaningful and personalized.
Absolutely. Purim Sameach.
Purim Sameach. Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance. Make sure to check out the show notes for links on how this topic is discussed on Deracheha.org. Contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.